Hello and welcome to a Twisted Tools tutorial video for Scapes. In this tutorial video, I'll be explaining all the fundamentals as well as the details behind Scapes. So let's begin. Scapes is an effects processor and a sound generator that uses 6 delays and feedback to process and create sounds. The 6 delays and their controls are built into one interface, making it easy to manipulate all 6 delays in real time. Since Scapes is a delay effect, you need to send its signal. You could choose what kind of signal you'd like to send to each of the 6 delays by choosing a source from within the Settings tab. To change the source for any of the 6 delays, simply drag the source menus. There are a total of 8 source choices for each delay. The first source choice is external, which allows you to route external audio into Scapes. The rest of the choices for sources are sound generators, which generate sound internally. You can learn more about the sources by turning on Reaktor's internal hint system by clicking the I button and hovering over a panel element. Let's explore setting up an external source. I'll select a preset called MIDI Polycomb 2, which uses the external source for each of the 6 delays. This preset produces a tuned comb filter effect, which turns the incoming vocal into chords.
Futuristic sound effects. Scapes.
The vocal you hear is coming from the included sampler called Beat Looper, which is set up as the default external source. You could preview the large library of included samples by using the sample knob, and you could restart the sounds via MIDI note by clicking on the MIDI button.
Scapes. 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 Scapes.
Let's adjust the mix level to hear the dry external source versus the effects produced by Scapes.
Producing futuristic sound effects. Scapes is an effect processor and sound generator capable of producing futuristic sound effects. Scapes.
If you'd like to use your own samples, you could simply right-click the waveform and choose Replace Sample.
Capable of producing futuristic sound effects.
Please note that if you save Scapes, you will be saving over the included samples. If you'd like to save the default sample map before making changes, simply double-click the waveform display and choose Save Map from the Edit menu, and choose a safe location for the backup. Go to the same menu to load the map back into Scapes. If you want to make your own maps, building your own custom map is easy. Just visit the link on the screen for a great free Reaktor map builder application. Next, let's look at routing audio from your host or your audio interface directly into Scapes instead of using Beat Looper. To do so, simply change the Beat Looper menu to Live mode. In doing so, audio is fed directly from your host right into Scapes. Please note that this setting is global and is not stored with your presets. This makes it convenient to try the included effects presets with your own sounds instead of the sampler. If you'd prefer to store the Beat Looper menu setting with the preset, simply right-click the Beat Looper menu and choose Show Properties. Then, click on the Function tab in the sidebar and uncheck the Snap Isolate checkbox at the bottom. In Reaktor, Snap Isolate will make any panel element, such as knobs, menus, and faders, immune from being stored or recalled with a preset. This is a very convenient Reaktor feature because you could easily modify your ensemble to make things like reverb level the same across many patches. To do so, simply right-click the reverb level knob and open the properties. In the Functions tab, click Snap Isolate. Next, let's look at some of the other options you'll find in the Settings tab. I'm going to switch over to the preset called Middle East Distortions, which uses some of the internal sources. Next to the source menu, you'll find mute and solo buttons, a MIDI and oscillator pitch section, a reverb, and delay. Mute and solo allow you to mute and solo the playback of each of the 6 delays. The MIDI in section allows you to control Scapes using your MIDI controller or by drawing notes in your host software. If the note button is on, you could control the pitch of any of Scapes' oscillator sources using a keyboard. If the key button is on, incoming MIDI notes will transpose the key for the scale setting found below. glide is on, a glide or glissando effect occurs between note intervals, based on the time set with the glide slider. The key and scale settings select a key and tuning scale for oscillator pitch, delay time, and grain pitch. When set to oscillator pitch, the oscillator's pitch will be locked into the selected scale if you are using an oscillator as a source. When the delay button is on, the delay time set in the delay cell will correspond to a note pitch in the selected scale. This is useful if you are using very short delay times with high feedback settings, as you will get a comb filter effect like we heard earlier, which sounds like chords. When the pitch button is on, the scales will be applied to the delay's pitch controls. This feature really only behaves as expected in several situations due to the complexities of the instrument. Next, let's look at the oscillator pitch controls. The oscillator pitch controls allow you to set the minimum and maximum note pitch for the output of the oscillator sources. Below the minimum and maximum knobs, you'll see the letters A, B, C, and D, which allow you to modulate the oscillator's pitch using any of the 4 modulation sequencers. You could think of the modulation sequencers as automation lanes that can be routed anywhere you see the letters A, B, C, and D. A modulation sequencer can be set by clicking the tab and drawing in the modulation sequencer lane. Additional settings can be found by clicking the Show Hide triangle near the power button. We'll look at all the modulation sequencer details in a minute. Lastly, in the settings area, you'll see the controls for global reverb and delay effect. You could think of these as master effects that get applied to everything once it is passed through Scapes. You could use the effects knob at the top of the panel to control the overall level of the global reverb and delay. Don't forget you could snap isolate this parameter, just like we did earlier. Before we move on to discuss all the parameter cell details and modulation options, let's first finish having a look at the main controls at the top of the panel. On the left, you'll see the mod button. This button will toggle all modulation on and off for the entire instrument. Next to that, you'll see the master randomizer button, which will essentially trigger all randomizers that are active. The yellow dot next to the master randomizer toggles all individual randomizers on and off. You could then make individual randomizers active or inactive by clicking the yellow button next to them. If the dot is yellow, the randomize button next to it will be triggered by the global randomize button. If it's gray, that randomizer will not be triggered by the global randomize button. Next to the global buttons are your envelope modes. There are basically 3 main modes: off, MIDI, and gate sequencer modes. When set to off, Scapes is always on and doesn't require MIDI note events to trigger it. When set to either MIDI 1 or MIDI 2 modes, sounds will only be audible when you play a note on your MIDI controller. MIDI 1 mode is basically a noise gate mode, whereby when you play a note on your controller, a noise gate opens, allowing the sound to pass through. MIDI 2 mode is similar to MIDI 1 mode in that a note causes a noise gate to open, but MIDI 2 mode also causes the feedback network to reset, basically starting the evolution of the sound over from scratch. MIDI 2 mode is useful if you're trying to get a sound to restart and repeat every time you play a note. When set to either Seek 1 or Seek 2 modes, sound will be audible whenever events from the gate sequencer occur. The gate sequencer can be accessed by clicking the Gate Seek tab. There are 6 tracks in the gate sequencer, 1 for each delay. An active step on a track opens the noise gate for that delay. Like the MIDI 2 mode, Seek 2 events not only cause a noise gate to open, but the feedback network for each delay is reset with each gate sequencer event. Next to the envelope mode menu, you have standard attack, sustain, and release controls to help you shape the sound's amplitude over time. Lastly, you'll find the dynamics control, which applies compression to your signal, controlling the dynamics before sending the signal to the effects. Okay, let's dig a bit deeper and have a look at the cell parameters. The cell parameters are organized into blocks, with slider controls for each of the 6 delays. Signal flows from left to right, beginning with the delay cell and ending with the volume. You could think of the rows as tracks passing through a series of effects. The effect parameters are delay time, feedback amount, grain size, grain pitch, filter, pan, and volume. You could switch between pan and volume by clicking the parameter label. Let's look at the delay cell to learn how a cell works. The delay cell sliders control the delay times for each of the 6 delays. Simply drag left to right to adjust a slider, right-click it to MIDI learn it or set up an OSC control in the properties, and double-click all cells to return them to their default state. At the bottom of the cells, you'll see a yellow slider which lets you set a minimum and maximum range for the sliders. For example, if you want the delay times to always be very short and the feedback times very high, you could set the minimum and maximum sliders by clicking and dragging like so. Next, if you'd like to modulate the delay time parameter for all 6 delays, you could choose A, B, C, or D to route modulation sequencers to the cell. The modulation coming into each cell is represented by white ghost sliders behind the main cell sliders. In order to make things more interesting, you could use the spread control. When the spread control amount is set to something other than 0, incoming modulation information is offset for each delay line in the cell. This makes it possible to have a single source of modulation doing something slightly different for each delay line. Next, let's look at slide. The slide control will do 2 things. It will smooth the incoming modulation messages and will also smooth the randomization of the main sliders. Clicking randomize with smooth on will give you a morphing effect. Don't forget that if you'd like to exclude a cell from being affected by a global randomize, simply click the yellow button next to the cell's randomize button and turn it off. You could still use the cell's randomize button, but it just won't be affected by global randomization. Next, let's look at the mod sequencers. There are 4 modulation sequencers, which you could think of as automators. They can either work cyclically, like an LFO, or like an envelope, depending on how you set them up. Let's look at mod A. Let's route mod A to the delay cell by clicking the A button on the delay cell. You could turn a modulator on or off by clicking the big power button in the upper right corner of a modulation sequencer. You can hide show the extra parameters by clicking on the triangle next to the power button. This hides all the modulation sequencer settings so that it is easier on the eye. You can set the start and end length of the mod sequencer by dragging the cycle area at the top of the mod sequencer. Set the speed of the mod sequencer by dragging the sequencer speed control vertically. The mod sequencer will always play back cyclically, like an LFO, unless you choose gate. Turn on gate mode if you want to restart the modulation sequencer every time you play a MIDI note. Turn on loop so that when you hold down a key on your controller, the modulation sequencer will loop until you release that key. This allows you to set up a modulation sequencer that works like a key-synced LFO. Choose smoothing to have smooth interpolation between steps in the mod sequencer. You can also simply apply smoothing at the cell level if you wish, but this way you could have one mod that is smooth and another that isn't, both going to the same destination cell. Var stands for variate and performs a consistent variation of the sequence playback order. This way you could get different patterns that repeat, as opposed to randomizing using the ran step feature, which will always randomize which step is played back. Invert inverts the shape of the modulation. The dot symbol includes or excludes the modulation sequencer's randomizer from being triggered by the global master randomization button. Next, you could turn on smooth randomizing by clicking SM, which creates a more natural smooth randomization when using the random button. If off, clicking randomize creates very random patterns. The cell button turns on the select tool, which allows you to select a cycle area or select an area for copy or paste. Next, click a waveform button to automatically create a pattern based on a classic waveform shape. This way, you could use the modulation sequencer like an LFO. The pattern will fill the whole modulation sequencer unless you've selected a specific area with the select tool. Lastly, the bend option will curve the waveform presets, and A, B, C, and D will let you automate the bending using another modulation sequencer for complex patterns and changes. Next, let's look at the gate sequencer in more detail. As discussed earlier, the gate sequencer has 6 tracks which send gates to the envelope, one for each of the 6 delays. When a gate event arrives at the envelope will then shape the volume of that delay line based on the ASR knob settings. You must use one of the 2 gate sequencer envelope modes in order to use the gate sequencer. To draw steps into a gate sequencer track, just click with your mouse. Drag a cell vertically to set the velocity setting for a step. The settings found above the gate sequencer are identical to those of the modulation sequencer, which we already discussed, so we could skip discussing them for now. At the upper right of the gate sequencer, you'll notice 2 sliders, velocity sensitivity and release sensitivity. Velocity sensitivity is the amount that velocity determines amplitude level of the envelope for a delay. Release sensitivity is the amount that velocity determines the release time of the ASR envelope. If cell rand is on, an active cell on a gate sequencer track will randomize all sliders for that delay. You can easily exclude an entire cell from being affected by this randomization by simply clicking the small yellow circle on a cell block randomizer. Last but not least, click on the Vision tab. Here you see a visualizer which not only looks great, but is really useful in helping you to understand what you are hearing as you're sculpting a sound. If you decide that you don't like it, simply hit the CPU button to turn it off, but be aware that this will cause. Okay, thank you very much. We hope that this tutorial has helped you and made you feel confident using Scapes. Thanks a lot and have fun.